All right, we are recording. This is the Service API's office hours for April 15, and just going to get started here. We had a lot of activity in the past week and lots of different opinions on things, so I think there's no shortage of things we could talk about today. There is no formal agenda for office hours, so as things come up, I think it's worth talking about. Now it looks like always having some trouble getting into Zoom web client. Let me check 1 second. All right, let's keep on going here. I think Bowie should be here soon. I wanted to start off just with what I think is a really, no, I'll leave this. That's something Bowie needs to be around for. One of the things that I think it would be good to get some consensus on is this idea, not actually this PR, but the idea of what the minimum version of Kubernetes we want service APIs to support. This PR would mean that service APIs only supported Kubernetes 1.16 or newer. That's just because the CRD API, the API extensions API v1 that allows defaulting does not exist until Kubernetes 1.16. It's a nice bit of functionality, but I know we have not actually specified anywhere what our minimum supported version of Kubernetes is. Any thoughts on if Kubernetes 1.16 is a reasonable starting point here?
I think the main reason to move to do that is not just for the defaulting, but also for all the other stuff you get out of CRD v1. Most importantly, pruning and I mean, explain is nice, but an open API support. But the pruning is really important because if you what we found with HTTP proxies, if you don't have pruning enabled, then you can say mistype part of your YAML and it will go into the object and be visible when you retrieve the object, but it won't do anything because it doesn't deserialize into the Go types. So you'll have config sitting there that looks like it should be doing something and it won't do anything at all because it gets accepted. And so until you have pruning and ignore unknown fields, then you don't get that. And without that, you need to have a validation webhook or something like that to actually validate that all the fields are set. Whereas if you have CRD v1, that stuff is done for you by the API server.
So I think the other consideration is when you expect this to go GA. So if you're planning to go GA in a year, then 1.16 will be pretty old by that time, and depending on 1.16 shouldn't be very unreasonable.
Yeah, I mean, the optimist in me always hopes that we'll have a release well before then, but we'll see. These things take time, and certainly.
What is GA?
Right. Yeah.
Does that mean going to beta, going to actual like V1? Because this is V1 Alpha 1. A year is conservative from getting from V1 Alpha 1 to actual fully GA out of beta.
Yeah.
V1 Alpha 1 isn't the right designation though, because there's as you pointed out, Andrew, that the TCP is just not spec'd at all. So there's major parts of the API which are just not even present.
Yeah, this is not even V1 Alpha 1.
I think to make progress on this, it would be good to write down kind of what our requirements are on the CRD framework, because that's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I think that the that pruning, which requires doesn't require CRDV1, but CRDV1 makes it mandatory. Makes running something that does this sort of controller makes the user experience much better. Enough in my mind that it's worth saying yes, Kubernetes 1.16 plus, and I mean, I do feel like this is a pretty experimental feature already, and requiring a newer version of Kubernetes doesn't seem like that big a stretch when you're working on something this experimental.
Isn't pruning also required to support a conversion webhooks?
Yes.
So if you want to be able to do a conversion webhook for maturing this API, then the pruning is going to be required anyway.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
that sounds like
kind of
wide consensus.
Yeah, I think at least 1.16 it sounds like. Does anyone know are more familiar with whatever CRD mechanisms are coming in the pipeline that potentially we would be dependent on?
Do you mean want to be dependent upon? Like what features would be available? Because I think what you're getting at is, should we make it 117, 118? Because what's coming then? I'm not aware, but
Yeah,
is that the question you're asking?
Yeah. Are we dependent on anything else?
I don't think so. I think that once you move to the V1 CRD actual resource, then I mean you get all of that stuff, and also then you have a GA contract as well. So so then we don't need to worry about stuff changing too much, and we should just be able to use the CRD resource without having to worry too much about new features. Like any new features that we add, we can choose to opt into whenever we're ready.
Okay. Yeah, it seems okay if we pencil in 116 as long as we write down this current discussion in some form, if it has to be revisited.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. If this PR is approved, there will have to be a follow-up PR to. Well, it sounds like either way, we need to specify that Kubernetes 1.16 is our minimum version, minimum supported version at this point, and make that clear in the docs. Okay, cool. I've got a couple more things that I thought were interesting from the past week, but is there any specific issue people are dying to talk about?
I mean, I think it's pretty important for us all to talk a little bit about some of the questions and queries that Andrew's raised. I think they're pretty fair. So there's that one. But I also think the larger thing that the more, actually it's actually smaller, but the other proximal thing that Andrew a discussion that Andrew opened in my mind is this all started from our discussion about the listener ports, and having a array of ports or slice of ports in under the listener, and I think that in my mind, a lot of the discussion that we've had over the last week has helped sort of solidify a bit that to me, I think that the way that this one that my current feeling is that the gateways should have one or more listeners, and each listener should have one or more ports. The ports should be objects, similar to port objects in other parts of Kubernetes. And like I'd be willing to argue with people about it, but my current feeling is that the protocol field in the port object should tell you something about how the controller that manages the gateway should behave. So if it's TCP, then it should just pass through TCP. If it's and then with the idea being that you can use just TCP to build up a full TCP stack below the gateway, or you can put in new HTTP or HTTPS to make assumptions about what about how the for the forwarding and the TLS termination and things like that will work. The corollaries to that are that if you do that, then the listener needs to have, each listener needs to have, I think, a binding directly to routes. You can't have the, I don't think it's possible to have like a list of routes somewhere else in the document that you then guess which ones are bound to. That will help with a few other things as well. And the other thing there is that the order in which we need to build the types, we need to figure out how the TCP one works first, and then there would need to be like a TLS one, which is a special case of the TCP one. So the documents basically would be, you build the TCP one first, that has a certain set of stuff. Then there's a TLS one that has like the TCP one plus some TLS stuff, and then there's a TCP one that has all of the stuff of the higher or the lower layers, and then the being able to drop a HTTP listener or a HTTPS listener, HTTP binding to a route underneath a listener is a convenience thing that means that you're sort of making a whole bunch of assumptions about how those things are configured. I literally have been thinking about this in the last 24 hours. I haven't written anything down yet. I'm sorry about that, but I just wanted to, I think that we really need to discuss this urgently now because, like we've got, thank you to Andrew, because we've got a use case for people who are actually building real TCP only use cases on bare metal and places where there's not where it's not just ingress, and the thing that you're talking about is not running in the cluster, and that is the really important difference.
And just
to clarify about this approach. Sorry, Rob, go ahead.
Just so I understand it real quick, you're proposing here to have every listener contain a lot more information. Each listener can have multiple ports, and each listener within a gateway is responsible for its own route selection. So route selection moves from gateway down to gateway listener.
Yes.
Is that the general scope of what you're proposing?
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
I have a question. Why not? There's a instead of saying all ports, the idea is to kind of reuse gateway, the same gateway, but bind many, many different things to it.
I think that yes, because I think that the idea, the thing that we've been talking about with having with merging gateways and things like that, I think it's really confusing when you're talking about because there's so many use cases that we're hitting, it's very confusing, and we either need to sit down and matrix out if you're going to use a gateway in a merging style where the gateways all get merged into a config that ends up on a load balancer somewhere, how does that work versus using a gateway directly as a thing that is going to configure a specific instance of a specific load balancer?
But this, I mean,
Right.
I guess this approach, I'm sort of confused a bit about what problems this is solving. So, but we can just table that. If you want to build everything on some strong notion of the proxying TCP, what do you want to do about supporting proxies that don't do HTTP proxies that don't do TCP proxying? Because there's a bunch of things in that class. Are we going to say that that's not supported infrastructure for that? You basically you have to have TCP proxying.
Well, the idea that if you were HTTP proxying, you are TCP proxying. You are doing a specific class of TCP proxying that only does HTTP, right? And so the point that I'm making is that we need to remember that if you're doing HTTP or HTTPS, you are doing a more specific type of TCP proxying.
Yeah, but no one.
I guess the question to me
what's
is
the benefit to having? What's the benefit to having
Yeah, sorry.
to forcing people to configure that?
I'm not saying that you would configure you're not. So the whole idea here is that I think the point that I got from I think, and Andrew needs to talk in a minute as well, because part of a lot of this has come from talking to him. And the point that he made, I think that was really fair, was that where we have been designing this to make it easy for HTTP use cases, which is fair because those are the majority of use cases. But we need to be really careful that by designing this to be easy for HTTP, we don't exclude TCP use cases because we're not thinking about how they're done. That's the point that I'm trying to make.
Yeah,
Sure, that's fair.
I'd like to. Is there one or two concrete TCP use cases that we can kind of look at?
Yeah.
Andrew.
Yeah. So to be fair, Nick, I didn't know you were going to bring this up because.
Yeah, I know. You and I were going to talk about it, but it's I haven't been able to.
But it's been percolating in your mind. So the complete flip of this, which is actually after we all spoke last week, I went back and said, okay, some of what James said, I see. And my mental model shifted and I started viewing the gateway as the virtual server. And so our entire implementation is currently using that. I'm trying to think, can I share? I can share this, I'm pretty sure. Well, this is, yeah. So yeah, I do have some concrete use cases. Essentially, we are building a fungible load balancer framework based on the service API, and it's completely L4. And think of it as you've got a controller, whether it's for HA proxy, for NSX, for Avi, whatever, and it needs to know certain things. Like essentially, it boils down to the gateways, right? And Nick, I'm going to ask you for some help here. But
Yeah,
where
sure.
it gets interesting, and this is what I missed last week that Nick pointed out. If your load balancer is running in the cluster is the load balancer control plane, okay? But if your load balancer is running outside of the cluster, then your load balancer control plane can be one of a couple of things. For Amazon, it's the ELB service. And I would argue there is no real construct of a load balancer in Amazon. What they call a load balancer is really, in the grand scheme of things, a virtual server. For NSX, you have the NSX API, and that's your service. That's the control plane, but you still have a load balancer construct to which you attach virtual servers. The control plane creates load balancers, and you attach virtual servers to those. The load balancer construct is important because it has things like size and max virtual servers. And when you have a multi-tenancy use case, when you might want to have multiple load balancer constructs in different namespaces, that becomes important because I don't want to say it boils down to on-prem and non-on-prem, but when you start wanting to apply quotas and restrictions to the load balancer construct there, you need to model it. And then the third case is, go ahead.
Sorry. No. Go ahead. There's significant lag. I apologize for any interruptions I have. I'm using the web client and it's just
I get
crazy.
Yeah, I get it. And so, let's see, that's the first case, the second case, and then, finally, there's the last case, which is HA proxy, which is literally what I've been working on since we've all spoke. Its control plane is even more fun because HA proxy, the control plane is it's the data plane API server, and that exists on every HA proxy instance that you're running. And so where NSX has a single control plane for all of its load balancers, and ELB does too, and then cluster does too. For HA proxy, you've got a control plane per load balancer instance. And so, and when you have a case where you need a per load balancer instance to be modeled for things like size, for quota, for virtual service per load balancer, you really need that represented somewhere in this model. And the actual concrete use case, and I'm trying to figure out how to say this without, I probably can say the whole thing, but I didn't verify it because I didn't know this was going to be brought up on this call. No worries. Is where you have a product where you may have a load balancer construct. And when I say load balancer construct, let me, how did I define it in my document? Because it's literally the first thing in my document that I defined. I said there are two constructs. A construct that listens on an IP address and ports and forwards traffic to backend servers. Example, an AWS Elastic Load Balancer. Two, a platform/control plane that manages virtual servers. Example, NSXT API, HA Proxy Data Plane API. To avoid confusion, this proposal defines load balancer as the platform or control plane that manages virtual servers, and virtual server as the construct that listens on IP addresses and ports and forwards traffic. So, in that definition, when you've got a product or project that says, I'm going to have multiple load balancers spread across multiple namespaces for reasons of access control and sizing, and I already said access control, and I need to attach virtual servers to those, it becomes really cumbersome for those to live at the cluster scope, which is why I filed that issue this week. I'm saying, oh, great. James said gateway is a virtual host. That makes sense. The one caveat is gateway class needs to also be namespaced, or there needs to be a namespaced version of it. And what Nick just said was, well, maybe if we push everything back down to the listener, which I'd already backed away from, because that's what I originally thought it was based on the documentation. Yeah. I backed away from that. I'm like, okay, well, this makes sense because routes are on the gateway is the virtual server. Either way, we're kind of shifting from the middle, left or right. And what's important to me is that that load balancer construct is modeled. And today, it is, if you look at it as the gateway class, but that's cluster scoped and therefore doesn't meet the use case of access control and having multiple ones per load balancer construct. And if it's the listener, then I would actually go back to what somebody filed earlier, which was like a proper virtual host CRD, and actually make these actual resources. Either way you shift it, though, I think, so I think that's what it boils down to for me. What makes sense would be to have gateway class be the load balancer and be namespaced, or introduce a new type called virtual server or virtual host, have it live on the gateways and replace the listeners, and then define the listeners there. But the use case is really multi-tenancy, where you've got that construct that has to be modeled. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so a couple of questions, like who is doing the scheduling? So this has actually come up previously. Alibaba, I think, 2 years ago, their ELB equivalent had quota restrictions, and they kind of wanted to have a controller that could schedule ingress, or I think it was ingress, but it might have been services, onto specific ones, because they didn't know a priori, like it wasn't just like go schedule onto this nebulous one.
Oh, sure.
It was actually, I had to assign it to a particular one.
Yeah. So part of
I kind of wanted to understand like how the flow that you want to support works in terms of who's doing the scheduling decision. Is the user doing it? Is some other system doing it? Are we?
So it's another system
that the user can choose.
So the proposal is to support a managed environment where it's getting wired up based upon intent defined elsewhere, but the eventual goal is that it's more of a framework that we aren't defining any of our own types, right? This is simply say, hey, there is the service API there, and as I described it to Nick, I was handed this on March 30th and said I had to deliver something by April 30th, hence my like showing up with such a sense of urgency. And I was looking at just my own type for a while with my team, and then I discovered y'all's types. And as I described it to somebody else, after I reread everything that y'all did, I was like, well, crap. If I had to build this from scratch, it would look exactly what y'all have, like exactly what you have, with a few tweaks here and there. And so it doesn't make any sense for us to do our own thing. And so, but so when I say we don't have our own types, we're kind of just defining a pattern that these controllers can follow. And eventually we would like to have like a reference case. Hey, if you just want to go out and you're a load balancer company and you want to say, I want to deploy L4 load balancers for Kubernetes services. Well, great, because guess what? There's this well-defined pattern that says there's a gateway class for your load balancer, and there are these, gateway class, and a gateway for all of your virtual servers. And if you've got some mechanization to create a gateway for every one of your services, oh wait, that's called a CPI, right? That's what we're going to build into the vSphere CPI, that it just creates these gateways for every service that is requesting a load balancer. Then, or a virtual server rather, that will be the mechanization point, would be the vSphere CPI, or CCM rather.
I see. Yeah, like the way that I've been looking at the API is one thought that we've put some, I guess, effort into is sort of thinking about it. So, for example, if you have in this current API some reification of the notion of like a physical load balancer, that may, is that like, does the user particularly care about that, or would that be a mechanism that is sort of like somewhat inside the controller control plane?
Well, so
depending on your implementation.
So you have to ask who's the user, but ultimately I don't think it's the user so much as the product, and it can't be part of the controller, because I mean, I guess it could, but I mean, I think James said in one of his comments, like, there could be this invisible proxy. James, I apologize if you used the word didn't use the word invisible, but I think the implication would be like it would just be some construct that would be managed by the controller without being modeled. But the thing is that Kubernetes already provides things like RBAC, right? It already says that if you've got people in a namespace and you want to drop a couple of load balancers in there, objects that they can control. And again, you can probably do all this with webhooks. That's what part of our proposal says today. Like, we don't have a path forward for the namespacification of this. Like, right now, the MVP is there's a single one at the cluster, and if we don't see this change by the time we need to move past the MVP, my recommendation to them is admission webhooks, and we'll have, you know, something with the names in the gateway classes to align them with the namespaces. But like, Kubernetes provides part of this with the way they do RBAC and with namespace. And the other case is, so you've got namespaces that represent part of your organizational hierarchy. Eng1, Eng2, production, whatever, right? You can, and this is one of the things I just love about what y'all do, it's all top down. It's all finding who belongs to me. And so you can move a gateway from one namespace to the other. And if, for example, the load balancer objects actually were the same name, or the gateway classes were the same name, but they just referenced actual backend load balancer constructs, all of a sudden, hey, your gateway just gets reconciled in that new namespace and nothing else changed. And I think that's amazing. That's great. And you get that today with gateway classes at the cluster level. But again, now you have to worry about who is managing those. And that
yeah, it would be.
Those really work when we have a single control plane for, and you don't have the actual load balancer construct, which ELB does not. Their construct is a virtual
right,
despite what they call it.
Yeah, it would be good to figure out, because I feel like I'm hearing sort of two user populations. Like, there's a user population that you're describing, which is sort of your control plane is going to be reacting and acting on certain objects. Like, what do you expect your user to be producing in terms of giving, like, which are the resources that are going to be acted upon from the user's perspective?
Sure. So right now we're working in two cases. Our MVP is for something internal, and then the goal is to move this in the what you just described, that aspect of it, both the pattern and the implementation, into the vSphere CCM. So from a user's perspective, they would create a service just like any other service, type load balancer, excuse me. And part of the proposal is that there are some well-known annotations, or there's a pattern that says this is platform specific in case you have HA proxy or you've got NSX or whatever. Like, I think HA proxy has a controller like this, but it's specific for HA proxy. Avi does, NSX does, but they're all specific for each other. They all use their own types, and they all forego the CPI. And this is saying, well, the CPI will just say, okay, the user says that this is service type load balancer. Here they specified maybe the name of the gateway class or the name of the load balancer to which this service wants to be attached. They wouldn't call it a gateway class. They would just say the name of the load balancer. And if one didn't exist, if they didn't specify
and that's
that,
a physical load balancer. Sorry, that's a physical
yes,
load
yeah,
balancer?
it would be, but it would be represented by the gateway class. And the idea would be, and from the perspective of the vSphere CCM, when it starts, it either specifies a default gateway class to attach all services, or gateways rather, or that there is some annotation that is standard that says a user can also specify that if they happen to know the name of the gateway class that they want. So that way you can specify. You go ahead.
Yeah. So like, that some thoughts come to mind, like what would happen, for example, how would you model ELB? Would it just be a single gateway for all ELB?
So I think Rob brought that up where I mentioned so I wasn't trying to take away the notion of a clustered gateway class. I actually like it. I think for ELB, it makes a lot of sense when you've got this single control plane and they have no notion of a load balancer. Again, it's a virtual server, despite what they call it. And so you've got internet and internal, and you just have a config, and it just points to the control plane, the ELB service. So I'm saying that could still be cluster scoped, but I think in a comment, Rob said, well, if we moved it to namespaced, then the name of the class, then if there wasn't a namespace, maybe it defaults to a namespace. I don't know, like, service API system. So like by default, everything goes there if you want to specify the namespace. Something,
yeah,
but I wasn't trying to remove the cluster, but that would be the way you would do it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like sort of how the model works, because the class model has come for both ingress and storage. Ingress is newer, so maybe it's a little bit less proven, but at least storage classes, how they handle some of these things, because there are certain, like, for example, I think there are some storage providers that sort of have these concrete physical, like, let's say you have a file server with like,
yeah, I'm trying to think of it too. I know exactly where you're going, and I don't know off the top of my head, because I was about to tell you, no, the storage control plane is no crap. No, they might have individual filers, and I would have to go look to see how they handle it. But yeah, they would have been dealing with the same thing. And unfortunately, from a VMware perspective, because of vSAN being around for so long, I guarantee you that's our class, or rather CSI is now. So it's not, I can't go look at our own stuff.
Yeah, so sorry I was not here last week, so I'm pretty sure you wrote like copious documentation that I have to go through now.
I may have written like one or two things, like a couple of words.
Okay.
It'll take you another week to read them.
Don't worry about it. It would be good if we kind of look at how storage classes, maybe it's like they hate it the way they've done it, but it sounds like there's similar problems there. I would like to kind of understand how they've treated it and whether or not they are satisfied with how they treated it.
That's fair. I can make some inroads there. I was one of the founders of CSI, Container Storage Interface, so I know a lot of the people that still work on it, and I'm sure they're going to have some answers. I just didn't, when I created it, I wasn't coming at it from a Kubernetes perspective, so I didn't care about the Kubernetes of it all back then. But Assad, who still works on it, I can check with him, although he's at Google with you. So, but yeah, I'll ping him.
Yeah, it's great that you have the CSI experience, and we can learn what they hate. I think that's the key.
Yeah, it was originally called libstorage, but when it came from Dell, it was called libstorage. No one wanted it, and all of a sudden, Google presented it, and it was called CSI because we contacted some friends at Google, and then people were like, "Great."
I think so. In my mind, the thing that I was trying to get to by raising this today, I'm sorry to just bring it on you, Andrew, was that I feel my feeling is that the questions you've raised some pretty fundamental questions about the way that we're structuring these things, and I don't think that spending more time tinkering with the lower down stuff like traffic split and stuff like that is actually going to be useful until we've because we might need to throw a lot of that away if we change how some more things of this work. James.
So I just would have 2 cents regards to what I think is Andrew's perspective. So gateway and gateway class, the whole services API is abstract, right? It's not so the way it's designed, I don't think it's an API for provisioning or configuring infrastructure. It's completely agnostic as to the infrastructure underneath it, and it's just like Ingress, it doesn't say anything about how it should be implemented. You can implement it however you want, and it's not an API that's targeted at provisioning or configuring the underlying infrastructure. Now, I think one of the sources of this conversation is that Andrew has a use case for representing underlying infrastructure types in Kubernetes objects, and he's like, well, there seems to be an overlap here, but that's not what Services API has been designed to do, and so he's trying to tweak it a bit to do something that I believe it was not kind of intended to do originally. Is that?
I think
Do people
I think
feel that's a fair comment?
I do agree with that, James. I think that was one of the advantages of Kubernetes is to be a bit more abstract and sort of leave it.
You're roboting really hard, Bowie.
Oh no. Hello?
Yeah.
better now.
Yep.
Sounds good to me.
WebRTC needs
Yep,
some
that's
love. Yeah, so luckily I ordered a laptop, a personal laptop, so maybe this will be improved. Yeah, I think I do agree 100% with James. It's like the notion of this abstract description. I think that's kind of been our target in terms of the users. So that's why there are some tensions in terms of trying to actually make it correspond one-to-one with physical infrastructure. Although I would like to see the use case and then understand what storage classes have done, because storage classes also were sort of in this space, just to understand what the trade-off was.
I'm also interested in the storage class background as well, and why it was chosen to be cluster scoped. When I looked through this and talked with Andrew some more about this, it was fascinating to me that it seems like we could solve a lot of this, at least for this use case, by doing something like we'd already discussed doing separately, which was the namespace scoped gateway class, which comes with other advantages that are positive regardlessly, right? It allows better modeling with RBAC. It allows easier ways to restrict who can create gateway classes where and where they can be used. And it helps in some other ways. I'm not saying that has to be the only solution, and I think there are other things we can clean up in gateway, like tying ports and protocols together, as an example, makes a lot of sense to me. I think there's a way to approach this that does not throw at everything, but does still solve this issue. And I'm interested in maybe this kind of hybrid approach where gateway class does move to namespace scoped if, pending discussions with storage class, with SIG storage and anyone else who has lots of experience in this space. But I'm also interested in some adjustments to gateway itself.
Yeah, so I think what next steps should we do? It sounds like a small group go investigate storage class, come back. Is tomorrow too soon?
Not soon enough for me. I mean, I'll ping some people because, like I said, I'm getting so many people are gonna hate me. I said, okay, we're moving to this paradigm. We're shifting this paradigm to gateway class being the load balancer from the gateway being the load balancer. And James, your comments are very fair. I understand, but like we also have to be realistic. We live in a world where infrastructure is important, and y'all come from a world where you don't have to worry about infrastructure in the cloud. And
right,
so
that's not the same thing as saying that infrastructure has to be configured with service APIs, right? You can maybe service APIs collaborates with some other representation of infrastructure. It's not necessary that service APIs
I think
has to decide to take
that's
the
fair.
entire
It's just
stack.
it's so close though that it to create something brand new when this is so close to being able to do both. That's what's so that's where I am, right?
That's where I think why I wanted to raise it today is that I feel like the fact that what Andrew wants to do is so close to what we're talking about doing with the service APIs anyway, says to me that it's worth having this conversation and doing it like urgently so that we can make sure that Andrew has the opportunity to use the upstream stuff as much as possible, and also that will help. Like answering a lot of these questions helps us answer like stuff that has been tricky for us, like where does TLS live and things like that. Like, I think that the reason that has been tricky for us is points to the fact that the model is not clear in some way. Because if the model was clear, then the place to put that stuff would be clear. Like and so I feel like having Andrew ask these questions is really useful to us as a sub project because answering these questions one way or another will help provide clarity on what we are actually trying to do here. If you see what I'm saying.
So the one thing, it's along kind of the response to Danien's proposal last week is like, in terms of API layering, you know, what could it be possible to kind of get what we want, for Andrew to get what he wants out of the API with the addition of, say, like one resource to model the physical infrastructure that's sort of independent. Like that in my mind is how much more is it going to be is he going to have to duplicate the entire API, or does he only have to add a small thing that cooperates with the API?
So I can answer that question. Rob and I forget, it was Rob and I or Nick and I discussed this. The gateway class today has parameters ref, right? But what it doesn't really have is a list of them. So regardless of what I do here, I have to do something really kind of hacky and use config maps and secrets, or maybe like a join table and a CRD. But whatever that is, if I have to introduce a new custom type, that is a dependency that we now own that's not part of some standard model. And I get that it's infrastructure specific. And so it's really a choice between two bad, it's really a choice between two bad choices. Owning a specific,
did you guys write that down? Sorry, I really apologize. I haven't looked at the issue. Is that tracked somewhere so we can chew on it in some form?
That's brand new. Like if you have to model that, that's what I haven't been concerned with. How do I model this invisibly or with a custom type? I've been concerned with introducing the concept that this type is important to be modeled and mapping it onto something with the smallest amount of change. So
yeah, it would really help if there was something, just even like a briefest of sketch, you can even put it on the mailing listserv or something, to just say like, I see like this happening, then this happening, then this happening, and here's the infrastructure, and then like these are the.
Oh, that's all there.
Okay.
That's all there. I did a few diagrams.
Can I jump in really quick? Because we've got, what, 12, 13 minutes left. And
sorry, I didn't mean to bring this up today.
No, it's fine. It's fine. No worries. And we can get back to this. I just want to hit the pause button on this topic for a second. Is tomorrow, if Rob, on the agenda, there is a topic I put there, and it's about SMI, the Service Mesh Interface. We're going to have one of the owners of that project join us tomorrow. I would like to make sure that topic stays #1, so that this person from SMI that joins us, when we're done, that this person can leave. But the point that I want to make is just that I think that we as a community need to come together and make sure that we're prepared for having this conversation tomorrow. So if everyone wants to independently look into SMI and the API specs there, but I think it would be a good idea for us to do some of that homework and then figure out as a community, where do we go from here? There's, the high level views, there's just considerable overlap with what we're doing and what they're doing.
Danny, if you know, let me look at the agenda. Do you know what the specific, or is it going to be an open discussion?
It was just an open discussion, brainstorm. We come to the table with our expertise of service APIs, and I forget the person's name that's joining us. It should be on the agenda. Is going to join us and potentially others, and they're going to they're going to bring their brain power to the table, and let's just discuss it and brainstorm it. But it would be nice if folks here could just spend some time looking at SMI and the API specs and just try to mentally prepare themselves for the discussion tomorrow.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks, Danian, for popping that up. I know we had a pretty interesting discussion.
By the way, well, was that all you had? Because I was going to talk about storage class real quick.
Yeah, no, we could go back there unless someone else has any
just,
specific questions about it. I just want to make sure that we're prepared and make the best use of this person's time that's going to be joining us tomorrow.
Yeah, just one last follow up on that. Thanks for organizing that and getting that on the agenda. And that for anyone looking, this concept came up in poll 57, and Danian's linked to the actual SMI spec for traffic split here. And I think a number of us have looked over it already. I agree, it does seem very close to what we'd originally proposed. So yeah, I completely agree.
Really,
we can take, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, and that link is specifically to the traffic split spec. But if you actually go back, there's the HTTP route group. There, I mean, they have a few APIs that that to me seem very similar to what we're wanting to do. So scroll down a little bit here, and yeah, you'll see the traffic specs. Go to traffic specs.
The telemetry.
The HTTP route group.
Too.
Yeah. So this is pretty similar to what we've talked about in the service APIs with the HTTP route idea, which is also similar to Ingress and to like to parts of Ingress and to the stuff that we do on Contour as well.
I'm curious, is anyone in this group actually very familiar with SMI? Danian, are you?
I'm not. You know, James brought this to my attention in the traffic splits PR, and so I took some time, did a quick review, and then the alarm started sounding in my head, and then I looked at the issues, and they actually have an issue where they call out service APIs. So that's kind of where I synced up with their community and said, hey, join us on one of our calls and let's kind of hash through this.
Are people using SMI in production? Like, is it in common deployment?
I don't think so. One of the things I did is I went to kind of the community to see who's involved. If you go to the contributors and you see that looks like there's quite a few Microsoft people that are involved in it. And it is that I believe it's at Grampelberg that offered to join our call tomorrow. So my point just being is if everyone could just take some time, do the homework so that we kind of make use out of Grampelberg and anyone else that's going to be joining us and have a thorough discussion on the topic. And I'll be doing the same.
Yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable.
Great.
And if possible, even before having that discussion, I mean, if Bowie, I'd really like to, kind of get your thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I looked at SMI, but it was way early, so I'll have to take a look again.
And to me, it's like if we look at what we're trying to accomplish, there's like the northbound stuff, which to me is like gateway class and gateway, and then there's the southbound stuff. It's like, okay, now what do we do with this request from the gateway down to the service or whatever object that we eventually want to send that request to, right? And it seems to me is that southbound that's where SMI seems to have the big overlap. And so as I've kind of thought about this initially, I'm like, okay, I mean, if we were to work together as two communities, does it make sense that maybe service APIs focuses more on that northbound side of the gateway and the gateway class? How do you instantiate, some instance that becomes an endpoint that, allows requests to come into a cluster and team up with the SMI team and deal with what do we do southbound from the gateway to the back end. So just something to think about. But I appreciate everyone just kind of taking some time so that we could have a good discussion with them tomorrow.
Thanks.
So I added something to the notes doc. It didn't look like there was a section for today, for April 15th. If it was the wrong doc, I apologize. But I did a quick digging.
That should be fine. We usually don't write down office hours because it's supposed to be like unagended, but it's perfect.
Just wanted to take a note. If it shouldn't be there, I can move it. I noted that on this storage page, like all of the NFS or filer where you might have individual pieces of infrastructure, there were no entry implementations, which I found interesting specifically for those. And then looking for one for a persistent volume claim, it does map directly to an NFS server and export. So if you look at it like that, it is kind of infrastructure. It's pointing directly to what would be a load balancer. So I can't answer whether they're happy with that situation. I only suppose that they might think that's the edge case.
So that's not CSI, that's persistent volumes, right?
Yeah. No, it's not CSI.
CSI is
okay. CSI is another layer of abstraction. Yeah, but I was looking specifically at NFS. See, it's unfair to just talk about CSI because that would be a separate layer of abstraction. And your example, James, it would be somebody building another layer of abstraction on top of service APIs to manage the infrastructure. So yeah, that would be where you would have, I don't know what it would be called, LBI, load balancer interface, and it might be based on resources. It might connect to those resources that are in the service API. But even, yeah, I'm not gonna bike shit on that.
Yeah, so I think, like I said, I think it's just, I wanted to raise it today because I think it's important that you got tight time frames like Andrew, and I know you're going to pick something basically if we can't sort something out in a reasonable time frame. And so, yeah, that's why I wanted to raise it today so that we could at least start talking about it.
Yeah, thanks. Does anyone have the action item to follow up with someone from SIG Storage, someone who's been involved in storage class, just to see if they've got, if they ran into
Andrew, you're free to do
being...
that, and I was going to ping Saad anyways, so.
I would feel like I'm not objective, so I would feel better if somebody else did it.
I'll talk to Saad then.
Okay.
And a reminder, our meeting tomorrow is the early time, so our meeting is not that far away. Our next meeting is not far away.
Yeah, I don't think I will make that one. I already did a 1:30 start this week. I probably can't do another one.
Ooh,
Yesterday,
man.
I just worked 2 a.m. till 9:30 a.m. yesterday because it was easier. And then up again. People, sometimes people. But I think we've only got like 2 minutes left, unless we've got something short. We should probably call.
Yeah, I think so. Well, thanks so much. Thanks to everyone who showed up. This is very helpful. And I think we've got lots to talk about in the next meeting too. So thanks. See you all tomorrow.
Thanks. Bye.